All right, thank you, Paul. And thank you for hanging in there. I know this is our last session. It's been a long day, so I appreciate you all still being here, coming back to talk a little bit about tool time. So I'm going to start this session by saying, who's not watched tool time ever? Right? Okay, a few folks. So for the few folks who've not watched tool time ever, Tim Taylor goes and he demos tools, and a lot of times there are accidents, either intentional or otherwise, right? So it's always a fun topic. So, like Paul said, this is going to be a little bit interactive. We've tested links. Most of the time they work, but every once in a while they don't. You know how links work. But we'll see how it goes. What I also don't wanted to do was just kill you with slides, because I had a lot of slides the last time, right? So that was to share some content with you, so you can take it back, and when you're reflecting on my session, perhaps look through some of the slides, and maybe perhaps even reuse it for your own conversations, right? So that usually I find value when I go to sessions. So this particular session, we're going to focus a little bit more on where are you struggling with tool. And just to go to the next slide here, it's always about what questions do you have as you're thinking about the S4 transition? And oftentimes, if it's about planning, if it's about execution, it's about post-production support, it's about custom code, you name it, we have a tool for it. So it's rarely that somebody comes up and has a question about something related to S4, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not quite sure where to go for it, right? But part of the problem is also that we have so many tools. And hence you see that slide with lots of links, and we had those 4 sections, if you will, in terms of how do you organize some of these tools. So what I'm going to do next is sort of just reflect a little bit back on what we saw this morning, right? So, and as you heard Chet talk about it, he covered probably the process part of it. We also talked about the Lean IX part of it, where we talked about the enterprise architecture view of it. So this sort of gives you an idea of how you would approach it. Obviously, you're looking at the process-centric view of how to drive a transformation. Relative to that, what is the impact for the architecture as well, right? So those have to be considered. I'm going to the next slide, which we had this morning, and we'll probably spend some time trying to have a conversation, because I feel like the morning session was kind of 30 minutes. I didn't have a good chance to talk to all of you. So the way I'd like to do, if you all are okay with it, is to perhaps get some feedback from you in terms of what are some questions that are top of mind that you either don't know how to answer it, you don't know where the assets are, where the resources are, and then perhaps it gives me a chance to bring some of this up, and then that makes it more valuable. So I know the last time we did this session, I asked folks about who's in the planning stage. So maybe just a show of hands, who's in the planning phase? Quite a few. Okay. How long have you been in the planning phase? Several months? Okay. 6 months? Okay. Are you at a point where you have the plan put together?
I've not made a decision yet on RISE.
Okay, not made a decision on RISE, but you figured out the color-coded brownfield, greenfield, and the color is brownfield, but RISE is still a question. Business case, value, all of that's good? Okay. Anybody else in your planning phase? Are you good with your business case?
Not yet. We are planning phase. Maybe like about 2 years now, 2+ years. It's a huge for DoD, Navy department.
Of course.
It takes time sometimes.
Sure.
But it's a 2 years plus.
Okay, so you're somewhere in the middle of your business case.
Yes.
You've decided what path you want to take, brown, green, somewhere.
We have like, we are going through those course of actions.
Okay. How about,
Reviewing.
okay. How about somebody else who's in planning and struggling with a question? Yes.
So we are going through planning phase and part is we want to understand what should be selected. We are going through that. Right now we are doing okay. 285 problem. What top
Okay.
5, 10
So middle of planning, leading towards selected data transition, looking at capabilities. So you're somewhere there. Yes, sir.
Okay, I just want my situation in
Sure.
So we did the we locked that node. Now we have to stop everything and business started focusing on the original language. Now we have two companies. So how are we going to create a common business case? Because one is on S4, one is on. So again, we are now struggling to get to that.
Okay.
That's a big challenge with this. It's a long runway we have from ECC to S4.
Right.
And business is not going to stop you for anything. How can we expedite it? How can we prepare ourselves?
Okay. So you're in the middle of planning. You thought you had it all figured out. Life happens. And then you're like, okay, now I'm sort of at pause. Okay. And this is typically, yes, sir.
Yeah, we restarted our planning in December. In terms of brownfield versus bluefield, we know that we're definitely not going to do greenfield. Brownfield is right or bluefield is more correct approach, we don't know yet.
Okay. You're sort of stuck in that navigating the choice. What's the right choice, right? But you have a leaning in preferred choice, but you would like more details about how do you know that's the right choice, right? And you'll.
Looking at our current business and IT situation, it feels that bluefield or selective data migration will be correct approach. But what value does it add for a program like that? We have no clue. And how do we add a business case around all that?
Sure. So, I mean, a lot of you give me good feedback, right? So in the middle of planning, you are at different points of making the decision, obviously looking at the next couple of years to go live, right? Who's really started no planning at all? You're sort of saying, hey, this is a 2026 project. Anybody here who's done zero planning? Okay, so it's,
So, what about the availability of specific add-ons like defense and military? That's available on ECC but not on HANA. So those kind of add-ons needs to be available too.
so not entirely true. I don't know. You're basically saying, hey, your information is it's not available for A&D, but it's available for, it's only available for ECC. Not entirely true, right? So there might be specific functions that are not available, right? So then you got to sort of look at what functions are not supported that currently work in ECC that may not be available, right? So those are things that come out of some of these tools, but we can have that conversation in terms of what is that information you're seeing that is not available in S4, and then maybe we can have a follow-up, right? So the good news was everybody's in planning. The good news is that everybody's looking to go live pretty soon. So we don't really have the topics, like if you look at the first pillar on the slide, the first couple of topics are just about getting people energized about S4, right? So how do you give a team an experience of the solution? And that's where a lot of times you'll see that simulation game that we do it together with a third-party vendor that supports us to bring your team together so you can have a fictional business scenario. You're selling water is a common example. But you bring the team together, you pit against each other, you look at the business data in the system, you look at some of the analytics in the system, you make decisions about business, and that gives you a feel of the system. So you're in the system experiencing how it feels to look at real-time analytics, look at some of the Fury applications that are available to you, and that gives you an idea of how to make this more interesting. A lot of times when customers are also struggling about value cases, we do what's called the board game. It's pretty interesting to do it. You can, again, do it with a team. It's almost like Monopoly. You have cards that you pick, you show somebody, and you say, is this valuable for you or not? And you go around a team and you talk a little bit more about how do you drive value cases, right? So these are sort of easy ways on how to engage your team. Who's taken a completely business process-centric view of planning? So basically saying, I'm not going to go look at the transition options. I'm going to look at how is my current business process set up. Okay. Was that based on business process documentation, or did you use tools like Signavio?
We are using the tool Architect.
Okay.
Business process models for about 287 processes for Department of Navy.
Okay. So you're probably unique because you have a lot of documentation on your process, right? Most customers I walk into, you had good business process documentation at the time of the implementation, which was, let's say, 15 years ago. Since then, people who put the system in are not here, right? So what do you do then? I talked this morning about saying you got to be focused on business process. Don't let the capability distract you too much. If you don't understand what you're going to change in the system, how are you going to show value next, right? How are you going to measure value when you go live? If you implement the same business process in S4, then all you've done is coded it into an S4 system, right? So that's why we talk about, and Chet probably talked about it, the different tools that are part of the transformation suite with Signavio and LeanIX, right? Some of what's called the process insights. Right now, if you remember, last year we had what was called the business process discovery reports. Those are being sunset. So we now go into what's called process insights for discovery. And that gives you KPI-based recommendations on what KPIs are relevant for you based on your usage data, right? So it can tell you pretty clearly, based on different process areas, different KPIs, what is relevant for your system, and it'll give you correction information. Now, you can take that, and it's a purely KPI-based information, but it doesn't give you the process-centric view of saying, how does this process step look like, and how many variants of the process step do I have? But I feel like if you don't have both those pieces together, you may not get the full value of how do you enhance this process when you get to S4. So that's where, on this first pillar, you'll see something about Signavio Plug and Gain. Has anybody heard about Plug and Gain? Have used it? One person, okay. I'm going to play a video just so that you get a little bit of a view of what it is, and then let's look at some more tools after that.
To hundreds of customers over the years, we often hear the same concerns. Transformation projects take too long and are too costly. We can't touch our running systems and processes. It's too disruptive. We understand that just getting started can often be a daunting, uphill challenge. Traditional methods can take months, if not years, and involve allocating key internal staff, hiring external consultants, conducting time-consuming interviews. This all leads to the unstructured collection of physical assets that are instantly obsolete the second they are produced. Well, this is where SAP Signavio steps in, with our plug and gain approach. This new approach radically speeds up project timelines from months to hours. You can now accelerate and digitize transformation projects by leveraging the combined value of SAP Signavio Process Transformation Suite. It supports SAP ERP customers in preparing faster, deploying faster, and realizing continuous value while running faster. It all begins with your existing ERP data, which is analyzed to give you direct insights into your organization's current processes, highlighting areas for improvement within hours. But sometimes, you still need to go deeper so that you can learn more about processes of interest. So, that same data is not only analyzed, but now piped automatically within process mining, giving you a more granular analysis of your process performance without any additional effort. From these direct and deep insights, you can design your future processes based on your best run execution. And not just on one process, but simultaneously on almost all of your SAP ERP end-to-end processes. You can then profit from SAP best practices to define your planned future state using the common language of process that helps to bridge the gap between business and IT, unlocking continuous and sustainable value for your transformation by reducing preparation from months to hours and making deployment faster and more seamless than ever before. enabling you to focus on real, sustainable, and continuous value generation on your journey in becoming an intelligent enterprise.
So going back to the slide for a second, so if you look at the content that I shared this morning, and if you really wanted to get into the process information, that's where you should start, right? You should look at requesting your Process Insights Discovery Edition, or you can also have, that's the free report. So it's similar to the BPI or the Process Discovery Report that we had. Now it's just renamed to Process Insights. It's still KPI driven. It just has a different technical setting of how you do it. So you download it, you upload it to SAP, and then it creates a report. If you take the full suite of Process Insight, you can choose how many process flows you want to mine, right? And then that can go into Process Intelligence and give you that full view from KPIs to end-to-end process. A lot of times, if you're talking to the business, if you're just talking capabilities and KPIs, it may not resonate because you're now throwing out data points based on KPI, comparing benchmarks with industry, right? So days outstanding, or the number of invoices are not cleared, or documents with errors, and so on. And every time you do share that information with the business, they may have a reason why something like that happened, right? So it's always better to have that end-to-end process view. And then also, if you could show them the types of variants you have for the same process and the errors that you might get with different processes, or in different regions, you're running different variants of the process. Now it makes a more compelling case about your system needs some retooling. And that sort of supports some of how you would drive your transformation approach, right? So that's one way to look about it. The other question that I get most of the time is, there's lots of information about S4 from SAP and obviously partners as well, right? From an SAP standpoint, the question is always about, why can't you all put all of this information at one central place so I don't have to go to 15 different sources to get the information? Does that resonate? Do you all think about that all the time, right? It would be nice if everything was at the same place. How many of you have seen the roadmap viewer? Quite a few, right? So if you're familiar with it, it's great. It's a really good resource that I suggest to people as you're in the planning phase. So the roadmap viewer gives you a view based on the Activate methodology, the different phases of the project, and then it tells you what specific activities you might need to do as you go from discover all the way to run, right? So if you're earlier on in the discover phase, it talks about what are the elements of strategic planning, for example. So here you can see that it's actually guiding you how to do your planning in the discover phase. So what do you need to explore? Which topics do you need to get educated on? And you go on, and then you look at how do you do scoping for value from an application standpoint. And then it gets into all these topics that we were just talking about, but at the same place. And if you click into any of these, it will also then take you to the accelerators and content that's available to you. So depending on where you are in the phase of the project, you've got all of this content in the same place. A lot of times, people don't see this, right? So it's got templates all the way. If I go into the prepare phase for a second, I believe it's in the prepare phase. If somebody is saying, I don't know how to go back and look at the evaluation of transition, right? How do I look at the different methods and how I transition to S4? Are there templates that I can use to score one transition option versus the other? You'll find it here. You'll find blogs that SAP and others have written about certain topics here. You'll find a lot of assets that you can use for your planning without having to go to 10 different sources. And we keep this updated so you don't have to go to different places to look at it, right? So I strongly suggest looking at this, both as a tool and an accelerator for your own education as well as for your teams, right? So a really good resource. The other one that I generally talk about is when you're often in a planning phase, there's somebody in the business who will ask you a question about, Which other customer has done a similar transition in our industry? How many times do you get that? Quite a bit, right? And a lot of times you will say, let me ask the SAP rep or my SI, and what's their experience? And then it goes into a loop, right? Because then the rep goes to go talk to somebody you don't hear for 3 weeks, and then the same sort of cycle follows. And then probably they come back and turns out the customer is not in your industry, the size is not relevant, and you wasted maybe 3 weeks, right? So there are links here that talk about the customer story finder. So if you go to the customer story finder link, you can search in your industry what other customers have gone through this similar transformation. And that allows you to have a better data point where you can now go back to the rep or the SI and say, hey, I'd like to specifically talk to this customer or the other, right? So I could bring up the link, but I think it's pretty obvious what it will do. So you can find customer stories here, right? So this allows you to now look at who else has done it. The next question I always get when a new release comes out is, what's new in this release? How many of you are trying to figure out what's new in the 2023 release, right? You've done some planning maybe 6 months ago. Maybe it was with 2022. Suddenly now 23 is out, and you're sort of saying, gee, I wonder what's in 23. Not only what's in 23, how is this relevant for the different stakeholder map that we saw this morning, right? So oftentimes I'll talk about the link called what's new. Give me a second. What's up? So if you go to the What's New viewer that you see at the builder case, it's easy to read. You can filter it. You can download it. You can use it as you are doing your planning, right? So let's say I'm going to bring this up just so you guys can have a look at it. As it comes up, you will see it's sorted by line of business. So you can, depending on who you're talking to and how you're organized as a strategy team or a transformation team, you start looking at it by industry. You can look at this from a solution area. You can go deeper and deeper, right? So now this allows you to divvy this up to sort of do that thing that I was talking in the morning, thing being a technical term, in terms of how do you generate interest with those stakeholders, right? So if you really clearly have an idea of who those stakeholders are, you can bring some of what's new in here and talk to them and see if it connects, right? So it's another really good resource that a lot of times gets overlooked. How many of you have run the readiness check? Almost everybody, right? So it's common practice now to run the readiness check. For those of you who haven't run it, I strongly urge you to run it, even though you might say the project's not due for the next 2 years, right? Because 23 is out, the next release is 25. So you don't have to wait till you run the readiness check when 25 is out, assuming you're trying to live on the edge and go live by 27, right? So for those of you who run the readiness check, you know what it does. It allows you to take your usage data. It measures it against what we call the simplification items, which are all the things that we've improved and enhanced in S4. And then it gives you a view of how does it impact your current system. It gives you a view of how is custom code impacted. The readiness check has a version of custom code, but you can also do detailed custom code. An interesting fact with custom code is most times, and we've got analytics back at SAP of all the custom code analysis we've done, most customers end up perhaps remediating 10 to 15% of the total code, right? So the rest of the code is either unused or it's redundant or you don't know where it came from. It might be duplicates of copies and so on and so forth, right? But a lot of times you have a challenge just trying to figure out how do you get to that point where you have a clear sense of how much code do you leave behind or remediate and so on. And what often I see is that you don't have any monitoring on your code turned on. Maybe a show of hands. Do you know if there's monitoring on your code turned on? usage? Rarely, right? That's a pretty typical response. We've got what's called the SCM, and there are links in here that'll point you to that. It allows you to turn the usage data on your custom code, so you can see how many people are using the code, how many times is it being called, how often is it critical in a closing period, and what have you. So that gives you a really good information to then say, if you're doing a brownfield and you've already settled on it, and I would imagine you've got thousands of lines of code and custom objects, without that usage statistics, you're probably signing up to do a lot of work without really knowing what to fix, right? So we generally recommend there's not any significant overhead when you turn on that code monitoring. And it's really good data that goes into a Fiori app for custom code that you can manage with, to the point where the Fiori custom code app has a feature now that if it collects the unused or the usage data for custom code, you can mark it for deletion as it runs through a brownfield process. So there's a way you can retire old obsolete code, but you have to go have that statistics and the usage before you mark anything for deletion, right? So it's really important that you pay attention to things like that. Okay. As we're thinking about tools right now, I want to put this back into a PowerPoint mode. The white papers themselves are very useful, especially if you're in the early planning phase, right? The manifestos itself, they give you a really good idea of a lot of the conversation that I had this morning in terms of what do you have to consider when you're doing a pure brownfield versus a greenfield versus what's called the selective data transition or a hybrid. In the market, people call it bluefield. It gives you all of the information in terms of what are some pre-projects you need to do. A lot of times there's still misinformation about what are some must-do prerequisites before you go to S4. A common one I hear, especially when looking at a brownfield or a hybrid, is you'll get somebody telling you that you have to do a full new GL conversion before you go to S4. How many of you have heard that? Right? It's not true. You activate a business function add-on before you do the brownfield. A lot of times, the information is written in a way where you'll read it and you'll assume that the business function activation means that you have to do a full new GL project. That's not true, right? So if you don't go through some of this documentation, you may carry that, and then you might say, oh, gee, I'm not going to go sign up for a big new GL project on ECC, spend 6 months to a year before I go to S4. In fact, Armstrong Ceilings is one of my customers in the East Coast here. They had a system that was a result of a lot of M&As they had done. They had a lot of redundant data in their system. They also wanted to do document splitting, one of the new GL functions. So we ended up doing the selective data transition. We removed all of those obsolete custom clients and custom objects and things like that that belong to the old business. We were also able to, post-go live, turn on the new GL features, right? So that became a transformation project for them based on a brownfield approach. Hubble Lighting is another customer here in the East Coast. They took a similar approach. They did a pure brownfield, but as part of that same project, they extended the timeline and turned on advanced credit management. Now that was their business case to sort of saying, hey, I'm doing brownfield, but I'm doing innovation in the FI space, right? So when you read these documentation, you get a lot more data in terms of what is real, and it comes from source that's SAP. One of the other things you often talk about is the user experience, right? So I have to guess that most folks are not analyzing how much Fiori you're going to turn on when you go to S4. Is that a fair statement? It is a fair statement, right? Not thought about it. A lot of you are shaking heads saying, yeah, not Fiori. But that, again, is a missed opportunity for transformation, right? I'm not saying that turn it on for the 500 folks who do 1 or 2 transactions, but look at the high-level apps and look at how you can get more power out of those apps that I talked about, which are more like a supervisor level. It could be an executive dashboard, right? So that is a missed opportunity. So you'll find things like that in these documents. The last thing I'll say, I know Paul's walking up. I probably got 5 minutes.
I'm just walking.
Okay, every time Paul walks up, I'm like, okay, something's happening. I've got 10 minutes. Is that what I have?
You have about
7.
7, 8.
Okay. So now I lost my train of thought.
I cost you 30 seconds. Go.
Yes, I was talking about Fury. So it's a missed opportunity, right? So most people think about rolling out Fury as a one or nothing. It's not, right? These tools will tell you what are the most valuable apps. We can do the analysis. The tools can do the analysis and tell you, these are the apps. It's not meant for creating purchase orders or creating a sales orders, right? It's looking at these transactional apps and analytical apps for the supervisors or people who are making business decisions. They show up in the morning, they open the dashboard, they see the KPI, pop right up. Nobody's running reports to BW to then publish to, God forbid, Tableau or some non-SAP tool, right? I'm joking. These dashboards are available for you. People, a lot of times, ignore that. So you can see now that regardless of what approach you pick, you can look at nuggets of how you can get business value. And if you show that particular scenario to a stakeholder, and if you say, every morning if you come back, the dashboard is going to be automatically available for you to make business decisions. Heck, we could turn on situation handling and could have jobs running that automatically make some business decisions about stock recounts and so on. Those are all transformational, right? It doesn't have to be this big, massive greenfield project where you're doing all of this again. So the message is go through these documentation, especially in the path forward and the manifestos. Gives you a lot of good information about how to think about the transformation. The last thing I'll tell you is about some of the tools on the last couple of columns. Anybody who's got a database that's about 20 terabytes plus?
I am
32. Can I see a 40? Okay.
like bidding.
44. Can I see a 50? All right, 44. He gets it? All right. Are you concerned about downtime? Yes, you're concerned about downtime, right? Let that not be a limitation for you to get to us for. The size of the database matters, but it only matters in relation to the transition approach you pick, right? So if you do a pure brownfield, you bring all of the data over. Absolutely matters, right? It could run for days. You don't have days, correct? But the good news is you don't need days, right? So we have tools, and some of the content will be in the deck. We've got tools, what's called the downtime optimized DMO, right? That's an approach, is a pretty standard approach. You do a bulk of the data transfer and the migration and the conversion in uptime. So Maple Leaf Food in Canada did that very elegantly. You can use that. It reduces the downtime to perhaps a weekend. I don't know if a weekend you can tolerate a weekend. Perhaps not, right? You might say, I've got only 12 hours. That's still okay. We've got I call it old. We've got what's called NZDT. It used to be the near zero downtime technology, right? You copy a system, put triggers on, it records everything, keeps the systems in sync, you cut over.
If I can do this in a weekend, my job will still be safe.
There you go. If you wanted to do it on a weekend, but remember, doing an S4 in a weekend is also not simple, right? Because you're talking about potentially a database migration if you're not on SAP. You might potentially be talking about going to another data center if it's RISE. You're talking about somebody who doesn't trust the system, quote unquote, the business, right? And they probably want to do validation for multiple hours. And you've got all the technical integration pieces that you need to be aware of, right? So even the 48 hours is kind of tight. But
Get the technical part done. Like,
sure.
Get the RISE up and the database up, running, connected. Give it to validation for over the weekend. Then we still are good. But that itself seems to be non-achievable many times.
And that's probably because you're not talking to the right people, right? And sometimes it's just that. Depending on who you talk to and who's got the experience, you get different information, to that new GL comment I made. The good news is, not the best, the readiness check has a downtime estimator included. So if you run the readiness check, the latest readiness check, tells you how long it's going to take. He's coming closer, so I'm getting closer. So I'm going to take 2 minutes. So you have options to do that, right? So one of the things I wanted to also, and Paul and I have talked about this constantly, is we've done many events now for the last several years. And a lot of you come, spend the time. We love having this conversation, but then I don't see you forever. Don't know what happens to your journeys. So we've talked about creating this community of folks who stay in touch, right? So we can give each other the latest information. So we'll continue to work on this. I'm going to leave these links. We'll try and figure out how to do more show and tell. But thank you again for the time. Paul, I'm going to hand it back to you.